Hey, 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 hey.
The power of culture lies in the power of story. Stories change people. Stories change and activate people.
What if we have to lie to expose the truth? We can actually playfully craft the world that we want.
In the morning.
You're listening to The Seed, Conversations for Radical Hope, a Pendle Hill podcast where Quakers and other seekers come together to explore visions of the world growing through the cracks of our broken systems. I'm your host, Dwight Dunston. For Season 5, we're focusing our attention on world building. It's easy to pinpoint everything that is currently going wrong, but what kind of world do we yearn to see and inhabit? Which historical models inspire us as we contemplate new ways of organizing society in the future? What creative visions of community motivate us to co-create future systems filled with values of cooperation, reciprocity, and love? And how can we begin to live in that new reality right now? On today's show, we have two guests. Later in the episode, we'll hear from artist and activist Favianna Rodriguez, a cultural strategist whose work harnesses the power of art to inspire social change. Favianna's creative activism encompasses climate justice, racial equity, and gender liberation. Today, Favianna will read from her essay, Harnessing Cultural Power to Heal the Planet and Ourselves. The audio of Favianna originally comes from the BTS Center's podcast, Climate Changed. We are thankful to them for allowing us to share this piece. You can explore more of their work at climatechangepodcast.org. Joining me for a conversation in this episode is Keil Troisi. Keil is a filmmaker and activist whose work blends creativity, mischief, and a passion for social justice. Raised in Pennsylvania, Keil attended Greenwood Friends School and Millville Quaker Meeting. He started making films as a teenager, and his love for storytelling took him to the School of Visual Arts in New York City, where he studied screenwriting. Afterwards, he moved to Los Angeles, becoming a story editor and consultant, helping others shape their stories. But Keil's journey didn't stop in Hollywood. Since 2012, he has been a key member of the Yes Men, an activist group known for using trickery and deception to impersonate corporate executives and government officials. Through these clever stunts, they expose corporate greed and shine a light on urgent issues like climate change. And through their creative interventions, Keil and the Yes Men show us how humor and disruption can drive conversations and inspire real-world change. Keil's work pushes boundaries and offers hope, from collaborating with activist groups worldwide to crafting campaigns that challenge the powerful. Keil, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I am eager to jump into a number of questions that were sparked from knowing about you, reading about you. Certainly our producer, Peterson, had a lot of brilliant things to say about you and crafted the questions from those places of knowing you and your work. And I want to slow down and just ask you, what's it like being Keil today?
What's it like being me today? That's a great question. I didn't, I wish that was more of the way that people started interviews. I like that. That's a really good question. It's sometimes difficult to juggle different aspects of my persona, especially because in my work, I'm often playing personas. And I think I have a lot of projects happening that require different energies and faces. I think for the last week, but definitely today too, my brain is sometimes does really well with that sort of thing. But right today, it's like struggling with who am I supposed to show up as in different places? So that's what I feel like at the moment, which is like, maybe it's a side effect of the kind of work I've been doing for recent years, but, I think it's a version of what everyone does in life generally, is figuring out like who am I when I present myself to other people in different spaces. it can get extra complicated when some of those spaces are imaginary, created.
Yeah, that resonates so much with the worlds that I inhabit, whether it's facilitating or being a podcast host. I'm sure we'll get more into trickster and theatrical energy in a little bit, but certainly as a clown, I think about, the preparation to get into my day or get into character or show some of my inward world to the outside world. Yeah, appreciate you sharing how you're arriving, how it is being you today.
I do like something about that question, and what I've heard of your show already is you at least are making an effort to like try to get to who somebody really is beneath a performance veneer. So that's a nice like way to kick off anyway, in a like ironic way, because it actually does get it like, well, how do you, regardless of the expectations that you might have on the character you're playing at a certain moment, it's I like that as a kickoff. Because it does try to maybe, and that's probably even part of Quaker practice in general, is of being silent. Like, what if I try to calm all the voices and try to figure out my actual, how I want to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Keil, in the realm of intros, what is something from your childhood that you hope endures into the future?
Well, it's pretty basic. I think what most people want to endure from childhood is a sense of play, like playfulness. When you're a child, you don't really fully comprehend how the world works or how it is, the state of it. I had an upbringing that was very modest in terms of money. Like nobody in my family or network had money, but they were all very loving and secure. And so that created a kind of a long unawareness of how the world actually functions. And I think that can create a sense of like, well, it can be whatever we make it. The world will be like, life will be what we do with it. And that basically is play, like where you just kind of create with other people, like the world that actually just seems like fun and happy, as opposed to being constrained by realities. There's something nice about childhood, not naivete, because it sounds like it's foolish, but like childhood purity, where it's actually more about like what's good and right, as opposed to like, what do I have to do, or what am I constrained by? What are the rules? Like, what are the systems that are keeping us in some terrible loop cycle? I hope what continues is a sense that we can actually playfully craft the world that we want, despite how much the world tries to constrain that. Which is something kids can have, that's why kids ask great questions, which like seem basic, but you're like, oh, actually, why is it like that? So why doesn't everybody just like have a little bit of money that is what they need? Like, why is there a huge disparity? It doesn't make sense. I remember as a kid being like baffled when I realized that my parents like didn't have enough money. And it was like, wait, I just assumed, of course, everybody has enough like to get by. I know we weren't rich, but like just that realization is like a child thing. And there's some truth to like what that like way of seeing things before you're kind of like spoiled by reality. So I would say I hope that persists to some degree, almost like a defiant rejection of some of the hard realities in an attempt to try to make them less real. Which is like another way of saying like playfulness. How about you?
Wow. Thank you for flipping that. I was just going to say, I resonate so much with what you shared, especially having worked in schools for close to 10 years. Young people will just say the thing. They'll just say the thing. There's not a lot of pleasantries. There's not a lot of, build up. And it's not even like a hard or easy thing. It is the thing. It feels like a truth. That made me laugh because the young people would say things, and there would be some part in my mind where I'd be like, you can't say that, like that's, and I'm like, oh no, they're actually like lifting the veil, speaking right to the thing they're not really concerned with or interested in, playing some sort of game or hiding out in different places in the conversation.
Yeah. When I feel most like I want to be as an adult, it's like aspects of being a kid again. That includes being great at being rebellious. Because when you tell a kid like this is just how it is, they're like, no, I reject that.
And your work with the Yes Men, you all have done some really bold and creative actions over the years, and pretending to be corporate execs, infiltrating conferences, pulling off these huge stunts that make people stop and pay attention. Can you tell us a bit about how you plan these actions? Maybe share a story or two about some of your favorite moments where everything came together just the right way?
Yeah, I first got involved just as a volunteer with this group because I had seen some movies, and I really liked the core concept. We call it identity correction. The process works by basically seeing representatives of a big corporation intentionally obscuring the truth of what they're doing, greenwashing or whitewashing their behavior. In identity correction, we basically just playfully pretend to become the company that we're criticizing and trying to get more awareness around, like the realities of their behavior, and then reveal it in the media. The reveal is super key because that's how people know about it. And that's distinct from what fake news, which is not intended to be known. It's supposed to remain fake. A recent project was criticizing Adidas because they owe millions of euros to garment workers in Southeast Asia. So we announced that on the heels of their new CEO coming in, they were appointing a co-CEO, a woman from the factory floor. So it was a garment worker would now be leading this company in order to adjust the ethics of their supply chain. So in that scenario, it is a kind of prefiguring a better alternative. It's utopian in the sense that a company like that would never do such a thing, but It's also grounded in the sense that everyone who hears it is like, well, that's a great idea. Like the people who are most aware of the conditions of doing the work actually should be leading these companies. I was excited about this whole approach of almost radical truth telling, where in order to get some truth out there, we have to create a fiction that makes people believe in some alternative world that we're building. Except often it's a world where, what if these companies told the truth? What if they actually weren't spending millions of dollars obscuring their behavior? So usually the process is we hear about some corporation that is doing something bad and they're obscuring it in their public communications. So hypocrisy, some company that's behaving hypocritically. Usually we hear about this from a campaign that is already working on some issue. All the projects that we do, including before I joined years ago, the S9 projects were all actually collaborations with a social justice campaign of some sort, which is also part of the values of this work. It's not, we kind of fit in the art world, but it's not art in the sense that a lot of art is kind of for its own sake. This approach is specifically under the ethos. These actions and these performances are only effective as part of a campaign, and then lots of campaigns as part of a movement. We usually hear about some company being terrible from campaigners, and they explain the hypocrisy that's happening and why it's important that people realize the hypocrisy. And then we devise some playful, usually funny action that involves mischief and rule breaking, a kind of transgressive performance, which is important also because a lot of traditional activism either looks too much like activism, and so people don't think of it. It doesn't affect people emotionally in the same way, or it's not transgressive enough. It's able to be co-opted by the systems we're criticizing. And then we pull it off. And sometimes that involves different levels of tricksterism, like infiltrating or going on TV or creating fake announcements. Usually there's two modes that we work in. One you could call prefigurative or utopian. And that's where we pretend to be some entity and announce publicly or perform publicly that we're changing course for the better. It's not real utopia, but it's a kind of prefiguring a better alternative where we just say, you know what? What if this company did come out and compensate all of its victims? Or what if this company did take responsibility? So that's one mode, which is like prefigurative or utopian. And the other is identity correction, which I was saying before, where you just basically come out and tell the truths for a company that they're not saying themselves. And usually those are really dark truths. Embodying them, pretending to be them, well, it gets the media to pay attention, sometimes when they're not paying attention to the campaign themselves. But also it affects people differently because it puts you in this different zone, like a different mental zone, where you're actually able to hear the kind of message in a more objective way than when you prejudge it as coming from a biased source.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was really closely connected and a little bit more loosely these days with Equate, Earthquaker Action Team, which I know you know about, have connections to. It's just so helpful for me to hear sort of the framework that Yes Men brings into their actions, because I now can place some of the actions done in Equate, and it's just helpful to know sort of the strategy and spirit from which those actions Equate embodied and were built from. And so thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And Equate, I really love the work they do. We work within the same coalition, the Vanguard SOS campaign, which is pressuring this Philadelphia region-based asset manager to offer more green funds and screen out fossil fuels. And they're actually, by many metrics, the biggest investor in fossil fuels. So we're pressuring them to change that. But what's so interesting too about that coalition, and speaking of Equate, is like, this is the importance of like working with a campaign and many campaigns within coalitions and then those within larger movements, because we do things as the Yes Men, as basically like clowns and tricksters that Equate wouldn't want to do because of different values and ethics and also different tactics. Like their tactics are super effective and super solid. It doesn't involve deceiving, even in the short term, anybody. And that's like important because of their philosophy. But that's the beauty of like a movement or of working in a coalition, is you kind of need all the approaches of nonviolent resistance. So it's great to have that as one piece of the nonviolent army, and then also have another piece that is happening on a different front. Because no single tactic, no single approach or action ever like does it. Like that's not the point of even any single action, is that it achieves, not even usually that it achieves specific things. Rarely is that like the end goal or expected goal. It's more just like a giant bucket of, slowly filling. What we bring as mischief makers is to do things that a lot of groups don't officially want to do themselves.
You and I both have experience with Quakers. You grew up in a Quaker home with a copy of Friend's Journal in your family bathroom, and you went to a Friend school. I didn't grow up Quaker, but I attended a Friend school. That's helped shape how I see the world. What about you, Keil? How do you think your Quaker background connects with the work you're doing now?
It might sound ironic, but I think it comes down to the truth thing, which is why I was so excited about the Yes Men tactics. And it sounds weird because I think if people hear the things we do, like we pretend for a short period to be people we're not, it is deceptive sounding. The Quakers are so devoted to truth, the truth of how you show up and how you represent yourself, and also how you stand, live, and die by your guiding principles, regardless of whatever system we're within. And that's kind of been, obviously no one's perfect. We're always imperfect about that stuff. But there's like a dedication to the pursuit of like real truth, deep truth. As a kid going to Quaker school, of course, like many young kids, you're like, the fun of it is to like disobey the rules and to not be quiet or to try to make your friend laugh when you're in meeting. But even then, like absorbing this like value of like basic truth and realizing that, oh, there's something more interesting to me in pretending, play acting in order to like hit at deeper truths than facts allow. There's a reason I went into fiction making.
Mm-hmm.
But not because I want to be deceptive. I think deceptive is almost the wrong word, just like fake news is the wrong way to describe it. It's in pursuit of deeper truths than our dominant forces are ever going to allow themselves to say. What if we have to lie to expose the truth? Something I also think is very Quaker, which is to empathize with what other people might see as their opponents or enemies. Mm-hmm. So much of Quaker practice is about empathizing even with our enemies, so to speak. And this work that we do where we have to become them, when it works best, we actually represent the truth of them, of their perspective. To even embody their voice in the writing, we write a lot of materials and websites and press releases and scripts and stuff, and then go on stage or go on TV or go on different places and pretend to be these people from these companies we're criticizing. But in order to do that without straw manning it, you actually do have to get inside their head and their heart. Quakers, I think at least the ones that raised me, are so great at not vilifying individuals who are parts of terrible systems, really empathizing with a lot of the people, even if they're oppressors or oppressing people in different things, they're not trying to hate the individuals, right? Because they understand, trying to get at more of a systemic problem. Really, we're trying to move the people who are in these companies who themselves aren't individually usually the problem. Maybe some CEOs are pretty terrible, but most of the people who work at these companies in different roles, if they leave, somebody else is going to keep doing the same thing. It's much, much bigger. The problems are much more systemic. So it is really important to me as someone who is exposed to a lot of Quaker values, this idea of empathizing even with the people who we might emotionally get super upset at because of what they're doing. I know that a lot of those middle managers aren't terrible people. How do they actually rationalize this stuff? How do they see these things? Mm-hmm. You basically play act in their heads. That's a version of extreme empathy, because the point isn't to punch down or sideways even. It's to punch up at the systemic problems.
I experienced both public education and private education, and I didn't have a lot of Quaker teachers when I went to Quaker school, but I remember in 9th grade having this teacher. The subject is a part of it, but there's something, it felt spiritual. This teacher was showing love to my soul, not just me, the student in front of him, but really had this deep concern with my spiritual well-being as well. And I grew up going to church too. And that was a different way that people were concerned or reaching for my spiritual well-being. There was something about being in the school setting and having a teacher really embody that. Even as a 14-year-old, I was this is different. There's something else happening here. Yeah, I appreciate you saying overly empathetic was your experience of the Quakers around you. Yeah, there was something about the belief system of this teacher coming through in the way they taught.
Mm-hmm. I mean, at Greenwood, at a certain point, we were all trained in peer mediation. Even just the existence of that as not a class, but it was an aspect of the education, puts something in your brain where you're oh, right, we will be in conflict. Our whole life, we will be in conflict with other people. But they're not individually the problem. There's stuff that made the bully at school be that way. I can mediate with him, it would be okay again. That innately carries this message of it's not individuals that are demonized or vilified, but we're all within these systems that make us do weird stuff, steal each other's lunch money, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
My experience at Quaker School too was there's a lot of approaches that were more meant to generate a feeling of agency. We need to do this. We are going to mediate this conflict. I'm not going to go call the principal and bring in the cops. It's better if actually we do deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these non-hierarchical approaches that just tell you the world needs fixing. We're the ones to do it, as opposed to, Well, hope somebody gets their act together, like it creates agency, which relates to the thing you're trying to talk about, the importance of creating alternative realities. Even if they're short term or even if they're fictions, the importance of just building something ourselves that is a better alternative.
Mm-hmm.
The need to do that requires this feeling that like actually it is in our capability and we actually should be the ones to make it true, to taste like alternative and better worlds until they're like become reality.
You've taken on big targets, corporations, governments, the fossil fuel industry. Tell us about a moment when the creative approach made all the difference. What happened when people saw your work and started to rethink the issue?
It's hard with any actions to say that this action led to this outcome in like a tangible campaign sense, because it is all about all of them working together. It also makes it hard to ever evaluate like what really worked because it was everybody doing different things. Some of the most tangible impacts I've seen has come from a series of projects I've been doing for the last couple of years on fossil fuel finance, pressuring big asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard to change. The prefigurative power, like the power of basically like pretending something is until it is, really does work. For example, in 2019, I did a project where I pretended to be BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, running this giant company that makes a lot of money off of fossil fuels, but officially wants to deal with climate change. He sends an annual letter to investors, just as like a beginning of the year, here's my outlook on the stock market. In collaboration with people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do, we basically wrote a letter on his behalf and sent it out to journalists just before he sent his real one. And it looked just like his real announcement. Wall Street was waiting for this letter. It's something that does move markets. And our version was in his voice, and it sounded like the way he writes. It just said that his giant company would make a couple specific tweaks to how they run their funds that would have ripple effects throughout the industry and change how they invest in fossil fuels. And they weren't just extreme broad stroke things like we're just cutting out this entire, it was like little tweaks that were very realistic and feasible, not even at the expense of profitability of anyone's funds. We sent that out. It got picked up by journalists who believed it was real for a short time, for about an hour the morning of. Some of them wrote about it as real. Then the rest of them, once they realized, of course, this isn't true. Anyone who actually just called the company would find out immediately that this isn't true. But they all wrote about it voraciously because all of the suggested changes that we had prefigured were so reasonable. That was 2019. And within a couple of years, we just saw the company every year, like little changes would be made. And you'd be like, oh, they literally just did that. Little tweaks the company made, at that scale, make huge effects. To some degree, that happens as well with Vanguard. I think when Vanguard SOS started pressuring them, 2020 maybe, around there, they offered no funds that screened out fossil fuels, no ESG funds, no green funds. Now they have one. That's in direct response to the campaign. And look, ESG funds are fraught with their own problems. It's not like that saves the day. It's not enough. It's never enough.
Right.
But it's just that little hint to realize that like these tactics, including like the trickery of it, does get the attention of these CEOs who run these giant companies who would never otherwise give you the time of day. Then it actually embeds in their mind. Like they end up having to do a lot of the stuff that we want them to do. They just wait. It's not on the heels of some big action or a big march, or the Quakers didn't shut down the campus and then they decide, hey, you know what? We're going to do what you're asking for. They wait until they get to look good about it, and that's totally fine. And we can allow that space for them to be like the heroes of making these changes. Over enough time, you can just see the pressure, like what this kind of like strategic creative pressure can lead to. And specifically, the mode of prefiguring what should be done, you could call it untrue. It's just untrue for now. It just hasn't come to pass yet.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these things that we're telling like these companies, how they should be, what they should do, in 5 years, it's going to be the reality. Like, you might as well just do the right thing now.
Mm-hmm. Right. On the one hand, as a clown, I experience the energy of creating a reality for folks to step into, inviting them into that world, playing in it, playing with the rules of that world, interacting with one another in that world. And there's something about what you're sharing, even with this letter, for that hour before folks were like, this is fake, you know? There was a world that people were living in that you all created. And then all of a sudden they're zipped out of it and they're like, wait a minute, that world, there's actually some things in that world. I just love that part of clowning, both in creating it, but also being a part of other worlds that people create.
Yeah.
You know, the show's over and I'm like, oh, wow, they just held a mirror up. That was, you know, why do we walk with our, you know, or do this, do that, you know?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good point. When you announce something is getting better and it makes you feel good and it's going to save actual lives, the climate, these little boring financial tweaks that Vanguard makes today, it will translate down the road to lives.
Mm-hmm.
Even the people at these companies get excited. They want to change. They themselves are often subconscious or not. They're stuck in terrible systems.
Yes.
So when they think that something's changing for the better, they're just as excited as anybody. The Twitter reactions to that fake Larry Fink letter before it was revealed, people weren't like, oh, this is a terrible idea. They were like, finally. And then,
Wow.
of course, you're saying, you come out with, this is just not true yet. But I think you're right that like, there's this little crack. I like the way you describe this season in the opener where you describe like the cracks in the system that we're part of.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's where everything is in those cracks. That crack in the system that just gives people a split second of like hope for something different.
Mm-hmm.
That's everything. And I think definitely like, even like at the scale of these giant companies, you assume, or you would stereotype as being full of people who like don't care about the environment. It's like, no, of course that's not true. Mm-hmm. Most people do want a livable future and they want a stable portfolio that isn't profiting off of the destruction of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to be just as excited.
Mm.
They just need to be pressured into taking some of those steps.
Right.
You should tell me more about this clowning too. I want to hear more about what you do.
I got into clowning last year. It's a new endeavor, but I've been an artist, you know, really claiming that identity for over 10 years now as a part of how I live and experience the world. There's so much I can say / nerd out about clowning. The thing that's coming to mind, and it feels connected to what I just shared and so much of what you shared, there's an opening through play, through creating new rules, as at least in the school of clown I was trained in, which is pachinko, a specific kind of clowning. There's so much about creating belief for the audience. That requires me as the clown, the person up front, to build that world and make it as tangible as I can and make the rules of it. I don't have to explain all of the ways that the world works, but enough of the rules of that world so that people can like hang on to things and be in it with me while I play there, while I struggle there, if I'm at war there, or if I'm sitting down for a meal, you know, they're sort of in the world with me. And then it ends, right? And then there's a close to it. So there's like this building of the world. We live in it for a while and then we close it down. It's been very humbling and profound to get people's reactions to some of the clowning I've done. And these aren't like 30-minute pieces, Keil. These are like 4-minute, 5-minute things mostly that I'm doing. And people are like, yeah, they come back with some reflections where I'm like, wow, you saw that? My impetus for creating the world, or like some of the core of what I was hoping people got out, gets put to the side because people are having their own experiences and their own transformation. They're repulsed by certain things, their own aversions to certain things. But all of it to me is like part of one's becoming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm sort of in it, in the piece, becoming this thing or creating this reality. People are witnessing it in it. And then once it ends, there's a becoming that they go through. And yeah, maybe while they're witnessing it.
Mm-hmm.
As a closing question, what are some everyday ways we can bring the trickster spirit into challenging systems and changing minds?
That's a really good question. The trickster spirit exists in accepting that we can take action to change the conditions that we're in, even if they're small and daily and seemingly minor. But the idea of like actually taking agency and taking control is super necessary as a first step to actual change. So I think the ways that we can like activate trickster is immediately anytime by breaking rules we don't think are good and breaking social norms that are wielded by dominant systems against us. There's all kinds of little ways, but once you start thinking about that stuff, and clowning is related to this, and so are things like drag, or like a lot of performance modes already exist to like subvert the norms that are used to control people and to oppress people or exploit people. In little playful ways, we can create moments of resistance to bad norms and rules, no matter our resources. So like the trickster ethos, it is a form of nonviolent resistance that specifically acknowledges, much in the way that a lot of Quakers do, that nonviolence is the way. It's like the only way. We will never outgun or outforce our opponent, like the systems we're resisting. They have all the force, and to use force in response to it is, for so many different reasons, not a good idea. The trickster approach is, look, we don't have their force and their power and their resources, but we can use some of their resources and power against them by playfully messing with them. So it is about like subverting their power with their own tools. That's something that all of us can do and should do all the time. Keeping in mind that in classical stories of the trickster archetype, they're a bit amoral, but when I'm applying the model of like the trickster to the activism, it is important to always be punching up with those tactics, which is why we're always thinking, what system is the real problem here? A lot of mischief can just punch laterally or downward on the wrong people. But as long as the trickster tactics are punching up against dominant power, then there's all kinds of little ways to mess with it. And they give us the tools. And that might involve costuming and props and the settings, the stages. We can have a lot of weird power by simply looking like a corporate white dude. It's satirizing their own biases in a way by showing like, look what I could do just because I was wearing a suit. And thrift store shoes.
Right.
So there's all kinds of ways for everyone of every race and background and resource level to manipulate the props and costumes and stages of power to like undermine them.
Keil, thank you so much for this conversation today, for sharing your brilliance and insights, power of creativity, activism, and tricksters. It's been such a joy, and I hope just the beginning of a convo between us about tricksters and clowning and theater and play, boldness, childlike boldness in play. To learn more about the Yes Men, visit theyesmen.org. You can also follow them on social media, on Facebook at The Yes Men Fix, or on X at The Yes Men. For these links, full show notes, and a transcript of today's episode, head on over to pendlehill.org/podcast. Our second guest today is Favianna Rodriguez, an acclaimed artist and cultural strategist. Favianna has spent her career using the power of art to confront some of the most urgent issues of our time, from climate justice to racial and gender equality. Her essay, Harnessing Cultural Power to Heal the Planet and Ourselves, is featured in the anthology All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and the Solutions for the Climate Crisis, co-edited by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Dr. Catherine Wilkinson. In this piece, Favianna speaks to the vital role that art and culture play in reshaping our narratives and imagining a more just and sustainable future. We're honored to share this audio from Favianna, originally featured on the BTS Center's podcast, Climate Changed.
The power of culture lies in the power of story. Stories change people. Stories change and activate people. And people have the power to change norms, cultural practices, and systems. Stories are like individual stars. For thousands of years, humans used the stars to tell stories and to help make sense of their lives, to orient them on the planet. Stories work in the same way. When many stars coalesce around similar themes, they form a narrative constellation that can disrupt business as usual. They reveal patterns and help illuminate that which was once obscured. The powerful shine in one story can inspire other stories. We need more transformational stories so that we can connect the dots and shift narratives. The climate movement has largely left storytellers and culture out of its strategy toolbox. Now is the time to change that. And here's how we can harness the power of culture for climate action. Pass the mic to artists and culture makers of color. Most of the prominent cultural icons speaking out about climate change are white. This is not because people of color don't get it or don't care. In fact, polling shows people of color are more alarmed or concerned than their white counterparts. That includes 69% of Latinx Americans, the most of any racial group. Gatekeepers must welcome in the wisdom of the communities most impacted by the extractive economy, frontline communities of color, and indigenous communities. Build diverse cultural infrastructure to support culture makers as they engage more deeply with climate topics and other social justice issues, and to harness their immense power to shape our core narratives. By fostering a more equitable cultural sector, we can cultivate the cultural content that propels robust climate action. Include artists and makers in your work. We need a new wave of artists who are succeeding in making visible the stories of those most affected. We must include creatives more thoughtfully in our change work, not just through one-off transactions like having a musician at your gala, but through long-term relationships with artists that build our cultural capacity. This could look like hosting an artist in residence, collaborating with artists to facilitate storytelling programs for your constituents, inviting an artist to join your board, teaming up with artists to design protests, or commissioning cultural activations. Make human stories to move human beings. Human stories are more powerful for inciting action than counting carbon or detailing melting glaciers. Fossil fuel extraction is not just a lamentable occurrence. Oil does not extract itself. Gas doesn't burn on its own. To talk about ecological devastation and climate chaos, we must talk about the fact that we live in a culture that condones the exploitation of other human beings and the lands on which they live, and severely impacts communities. Let culture connect us to nature. A global culture of domination and extraction has severed our human relationship to nature. But a culture of stewardship and ecological harmony can reconnect us to our ancestral stories, in which we were more deeply connected to nature and her rhythms. Culture allows us to confront, acknowledge, and mourn what was lost while offering a way to move forward. The forced displacement and enslavement of African people, the genocide of indigenous people, and the colonization project more generally have had a devastating impact on our relationship to nature. And that is a wound that must be tended. Stand in the power of yes. In the social justice movement, I've observed that our work is often centered on what we are against. We are clear about what we don't want, the no. And that's understandable when our communities are constantly being attacked. Our movements become our first line of defense. But we cannot envision a future when we're stuck in fight or flight. We must also create a culture that is about our yes. And this is where we can rely on artists. There must be room for creation that is captivating and irresistible. We can use our radical imagination to visualize and manifest another world, and we can make that world feel real through cultural products like TV shows, films, comic books, images, or songs. The stories we tell will determine whether our society declines and self-destructs or whether we can heal and thrive.
That was Favianna Rodriguez reading from her essay, Harnessing Cultural Power to Heal the Planet and Ourselves. You can find the full essay in the anthology All We Can Save, available at allwecansave.earth. And you can hear more from Favianna in Season 3, Episode 1 of the BTS Center's podcast, Climate Changed. It is titled The Power of Ritual and Story. The episode features Favianna alongside Brian McLaren, a renowned author and public theologian. You can explore it at climatechanged.org. To stay connected with Favianna and her powerful work, visit her website at favianna.com and follow her on Instagram at Favianna1. Wow. I'm feeling so grateful to Keil and Favianna for their sharings this episode. The power of art, the power of creativity, the power of imagination to inspire change, to nurture and cultivate change, to bring people together, to help us tell the truth. I know for me, there's often something that comes up as an artist of whether or not I'm saying the thing I'm trying to say through the art with the most integrity I can. You know, there's something I'm always reaching for, of expressing the most truth I can through my art. Just through the conversation and sharings that we had on this episode, I feel myself filled with grace for myself. There's some absolving that's happening with whatever that energy is inside of me, pushing me to the most quote unquote perfect or nice, neat truth. I actually feel like I can be a little bit more messier as an artist and thus as a person. If you're like me, you're leaving with some questions, you're leaving with maybe one or two concrete next steps about where you can go, where you can take this. You're feeling a little rattled inside, but also a little bit more at peace. And if you're feeling other things that are different from what I'm feeling right now, that is perfectly fine as well. I want to just invite you, if it's available for you in this moment, to take 3 deep breaths in. And as you transition to whatever's next in your day, know that I believe in you. I'm rooting for you. I'm in growth and process alongside you. And I can't wait until our next episode together. The Seed is a project of Pendle Hill, a Quaker center open to all for spirit-led learning, retreat, and community. We're located in Wallingford, Pennsylvania, on the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We host retreats, workshops, and lectures all year round. For a full list of these upcoming education opportunities, visit pendlehill.org/learn. I invite you to be a part of this conversation. We created a listener survey form for you. It is quick and easy to complete. We need your input as we plan season 6 of The Seed. Fill out the form and we will give you a special gift. You will receive a coupon code for 20% off of any purchase in the Pendle Hill bookstore. To complete the survey, visit podcast@pendlehill.org. That's podcast@pendlehill.org. This episode was produced and edited by Peterson Toscano. Our theme music is The I Rise Project by Reverend Retta Morgan and Bennett Kuhn, produced by Astronautical Records. Other music comes from epidemicsound.com and Elise Silvestri. You also heard some music that I created. The Seed podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Thomas H. and Mary Williams Shoemaker Fund. Thank you. You can stay in touch by following us at Pendle Hill Seed on all social media platforms or by emailing podcast@pendlehill.org. That's podcast@pendlehill.org. For a full episode transcript, links, and show notes, visit pendlehill.org/podcast. You can also worship with me online through Pendle Hill once a month. I attend this virtual Quaker meeting on the last Friday of the month. The worship begins at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time and lasts about 40 minutes. To access the virtual worship space via Zoom, visit pendlehill.org/explore/worship. If you're finding these conversations meaningful, consider supporting our work financially. Simply head over to pendlehill.org/donate. You can also support us by letting people in your life know about our podcast. We want to connect with other folks like you, so please subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast platform. These seeds could not be planted without you. Something like that. Thank you, Peterson.